Hi everyone, and welcome to another episode of Chemistry with Wikipedia. Today I will be doing a tutorial on scientific notation. So I'm going to go through and explain what it is, and then most importantly, how do we put in values in scientific notation into the calculator to get the answers that we want. So notation is just when we express values with a lot of zeros without zeros. So instead of writing the zeros, we put times 10 to a given power. So this n represents the number or the start of the number that we're talking about. This value has to be between 1 and 9. So I can have 1.00000001 all the way to 9.999999999. It just can't be a two-digit value because two-digit values can be put into scientific notation. This e value represents the exponent to which I am raising the power. If it's a positive exponent, that means that my value is greater than 10 and the zeros go behind the original number, this n here. If my e is negative, that doesn't mean that the value is negative. It means that the number is less than 1. So 5 times 10 to the negative 4 doesn't mean that I have negative 5. It means that the zeros are in front of the 5 instead of behind the 5. So the positive and the negative signs just tell you where the zeros go. So if we are converting into standard notation, when we raise to the positive power, we move the decimal space to the right. The zeros go behind the original number, and that is how we write it. So here, if I have 6.4 times 10 to the 5th, it means that I am moving my decimal place 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 spaces to the right, and then I fill in with zeros. So 6.4 times 10 to the 5th is just 640,000. All right, so now if I do the opposite, if I raise to a negative power, this is a typo. This should say to the negative e. So when I raise to a negative exponent, then that means the value is less than 10. So that means that instead of moving the decimal place to the right here and putting zeros behind my value, I move the decimal place to the left and the zeros go in front of my value. So 6.4 times 10 to the negative 5th, I move my decimal places 5 spaces to the left. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and I fill those in with zeros. Usually when we have a decimal place, we put a 0 in front of that so that we can clearly see that there's a decimal there. You don't have to put the 0 in front here, but you do need to put the decimal place. So 6.4 times 10 to the negative 5th is 0.000064. When we go the opposite direction, when we take our standard notation and we convert it into scientific notation, we do the same thing. We count from our original decimal place to where we want the decimal place to go. The decimal place is always going to go behind the first non-zero digit. So here, my first non-zero is 5. So the decimal place goes between the 5 and the 7. And then I just count the number of spaces it took me to get to the 7. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So this would be 5.7 times 10 to the 8th power. It is a positive 8 because my number here is greater than 1. The zeros started behind the non-zero digits. So if your zeros are behind your number, it's a positive exponent. So this is just 8. You can put plus 8 if you want to. It doesn't make any difference. If our value is less than 1, meaning the zeros are in front of my non-zero digits, then that means that my exponent is going to be negative. I do the same thing. I'm going to put the decimal place behind the first non-zero, which is still 5, and I count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 places. So this is still 5.7 times 10, and this time, because our value was less than 1, it's to the negative 8. All right, so that is scientific notation in a nutshell. So what do we do with this? For us, we are going to be putting scientific notation values into our calculator, so we need to know how to do that. So here I have a calculator. So we can enter our values in 2 different ways. We can either put them in just as written, times 10, caret whatever exponent you have, or we can use the E button on the calculator. Either way, we want to make sure that we put our entire scientific notation value in parentheses to make sure that we are telling our calculator what we want to do correctly. So we get 1.6 times 10 caret means exponent, and then -7. When you put negative values into your calculator, make sure that you're using the negative button that's next to the enter button and not the minus sign. If you try to put the minus sign, it's going to give you a syntax error. So we want to avoid using the minus. We want to avoid using the minus sign, and we want to use the negative sign here. All right. And then we close our parentheses, and now we divide by 8.0 times 10 caret 5, close parentheses. All right, so our answer here is 2e -13. So this e just means times 10. So my answer is 2 times 10 to the -13 power. Whenever we do calculations using scientific notation, we need to make sure that you look to the end of the number to see if there's any scientific notation values. This was pretty easy to see because I didn't have a long string of decimal places, but if I did happen to get an answer that had a long string of decimal places, I want to make sure that I check to see if my value is in scientific notation. So for example, if I do 1.6 times 10 to the -7 divided by 1.1 times 10 caret to the 5th, enter, and I get this value here. So my answer is going to be 1.45, 4545, but we can see here that it says e to the -12, so we need to make sure that we put times 10 to the -12 when we write out our answer. So anytime you're dealing with scientific notation values, always go back to the end of your number and check to see whether or not there is an exponent involved there. All right. So we can do this calculation just this way, times 10 to the caret, whatever our whatever our exponent is, or we can use this E button that's on the calculator. So even though it writes out as E, it's listed as EE on the calculator. Usually on any kind of TI calculator, it'll be above the 7. In this case, for this calculator, we actually have to hit the second button because it's in yellow. All the yellow buttons here mean that you have to hit the second to get access to it. All the green buttons mean you have to hit the alpha to get access to it. All right. So that just means that instead of using the times 10, I'm just going to write E. When we use the E, we don't have to put parentheses. So if I do 1.6, I'm going to do second comma to get the E, -7, divided by 8.0, second comma for E to the 5th, and I get 2 times 10 to the -13. When you use the E, the parentheses are non-essential, but with the times 10, you have to put parentheses. Let's do this problem again without any parentheses, times 10 to the -7 divided by 8.0 times 10 to the 5th. All right, the answer I get here is 0.002, which is very different from 2 times 10 to the -13. So your calculator isn't smart enough to know that this whole thing is scientific notation, so it's using orders of operation, which means that the answers that you get are going to be incorrect. So you just have to make sure that you put it in parentheses if you're doing the times 10 in order to get the correct answer. All right, so that is scientific notation. This has been another episode of Chemistry with Wikipedia Tutorial Edition. I hope you learned something, and until next time, keep on chemin'.